Well, I'm excited to bring in our next speaker for the day. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Bukky Yusuf. Well, is a senior leader, science teacher and consultant. She has undertaken a number of leadership roles within mainstream, special school and is also an ambassador for Leadership Matters. She is a network leader for Women Ed. She was also appointed as a co-chair of EdTech Leadership Group to support Department of Education's EdTech strategy. Let's go ahead and welcome her on board.
Hi everyone, my name is Bukky Yusuf and I'm going to be talking through effective teaching strategies for students with additional learning needs. There will be three specific outcomes or aims for today's session. We're going to be looking at two key definitions, one about additional learning needs, what it means and how we can then implement it. We're going to be looking at what successful teaching and learning strategies look like and go into some specific strategies you can use. So first of all, additional learning needs. It has a number of different things, but what does it actually mean? And I'm sure in the chat you can actually share your thoughts, which I will pick up at the end. But when we come to additional learning needs, sometimes referred to as additional educational needs, these refer to young people that may face additional barriers to their education and learning. Now, this reference from the Department for Education of Northern Ireland gives you a category of students that this may apply to. Within the context of your own school or the countries that you teach in, these students may differ, but if there are any barriers to their learning, they may also be classified as students that have special educational needs and disability SEND. And it therefore means that differentiation is key in order to ensure that they are learning as best as they can and our teaching strategies are appropriate. We need to differentiate. But differentiation means different things to different people. And I would like to share what differentiation actually means with my regards. Now, as you can actually see here, differentiation or differentiated instruction basically means that you as a teacher, you know your students so well that you can anticipate what particular learning difficulties they may encounter and think about how you're going to navigate that. But ultimately, no matter which particular strategy that you employ, it must actually lead to greater independence. The students may actually start off leaning on you or using some of the scaffolding that you provide, but eventually we want to move them, no matter what their ability is, towards independent learning processes. So in essence, if we were to summarize it in two key terms, differentiation means providing appropriate support for your students and ensuring that there is stretch or challenge for the more able. Because one of the things that we sometimes have as a myth, differentiation is not just for our least able, it can also be for our more able students. And there are key principles for differentiation. So Sarah Barb, in her article here that was shared quite a number of years ago, highlighted it as three key things. The zone of proximal development, so basically means that it should not be too easy, but there should be a little bit of challenge where the students are being stretched in their thinking and therefore will undertake learning. Your students don't always have to write to demonstrate their learning. And lastly, questions can actually help with differentiation. And I'll give you some tips and guidelines about how we can actually do that. Dr. Susanna Pincus actually goes on to share some additional key points for differentiation. The learning outcomes or learning objectives you share and provide for the students have to be specific. I'll give you some examples of what this could actually look like. It's really important before you teach any new concepts that you find out what your students already know. And we have to be clear about what differentiation is not. So there are a lot of myths out there. So differentiation does not mean to say that you have lots of different worksheets for the different students. It is not designed necessarily to generate more work for you. As I say, once you know what your students are, you can be very incisive and very clear about the teaching strategies you provide that will aid them to progress as they demonstrate their learning. It also links to engagement. So you have to make sure you hook your students. We've mentioned about scaffolding before, and the key, as I say, to reinforce, they have to have independent learning. And before we go on to some of the strategies, if we actually stick at these three concepts, your students need to be thinking. If they are busy, but not necessarily progressing, that is not effective teaching nor learning. So you need to provide challenge for all your students, as I said before, including your most able. There need to be a variety of options. I know some of our students are very wedded to the idea of having one clear answer, but where you've got openness, this will particularly aid your students who are more able because they will think in breadth and depth in various ways. And you need to ensure that even if it's just one child in your class, that they have the appropriate scaffolding whenever they actually need it. You can differentiate the verbal explanations you provide. You can differentiate the worksheets. You can also differentiate your classroom environment, and you may have help stations where students who need it, they have resources, activities, technology that they can actually use to aid their learning. When we go through these strategies, I would like you to think about what you can use, what you can ditch, and what you may want to just tweak and refine. So even though they will not be strategies for every single strategy, for every single subject, these principles can be adapted for any subject, or even a key stage from your youngest students to those at age 16 and above. So let's get on with some examples of strategies. It is really important for effective teaching strategies, that you have these 7 key principles. Think about, what do you want your students to get on with? How do you model the process? How do you think about what you want your students to actually develop and practice a particular skills? Are there particular activities that they have to do? How do you check their understanding? How do you provide feedback to the whole class that encompasses everyone, even though you've got individual specific feedback that students need to act upon? And your questioning. So these are the key principles that underlie the strategies that I'm going to share. Now, this obviously is from a UK context where you've got a key stage 3, year 7 scheme of work. And by a scheme of work, it is an overview, a summary of the concepts, the topics, the key topics that will actually be provided or covered within a unit. So this could actually last maybe for half a term, maybe for 6 weeks. It could maybe run for several months, but it provides you an overview so that you are clear about all the different aspects that need to be covered. And most importantly, how they interlink. It's like building up a brickwork for young people. So when I talk about having the end in mind, even on an individual lesson by lesson basis, ask yourself this question: by the end of this lesson, what do I want my students to have learned? Now, thinking about this before you even plan your lesson, it aids clarity, but it enables you to provide the steps to success. They know what they have to do to demonstrate their learning and therefore show progress. When you can ask this, you can also think about the incremental development points. So as I say, your learning outcomes need to specifically show what the students are doing that demonstrates they've hit those particular milestones. They need to build upon each other. So you should start off with the easiest learning outcome, and it gets progressively more difficult. So it encompasses challenge for all of your students, and it aids progress. Now, here's an example of a resource I provided on the TES. There are 3 learning outcomes in this particular lesson. And for each of those, there are 3 specific learning activities. So learning outcome 1 will have learning activity A linked to it. The students can actually demonstrate what they've hit, and so it goes on. In addition to that, I also consider the questions you ask that will stimulate interest and hook your young learners, support the students that need it, and also provide stretch for the more able students. Here's an example of a learning outcome, very specific. So by the end of this lesson, the students will be able to cook a well-done steak within 4 to 6 minutes. It's very, very specific. And as you can see, it shows about the actions, what resources, etc. Every young person will be clear about whether or not they've actually met that particular outcome. Here's another one. So if you're looking at your schemes of learning, so you've got topics that are being covered over a longer period of time beyond one particular lesson, there may be different things that they're actually going to be demonstrating, but it's very specific and very clear to the subjects that you actually teach. Now, modelling. There are many different ways of doing this, but the clearest way is one that Sean Killian has actually outlined, where the I do, we do, you do. And I'm going to break that down because there are actually 8 different steps within that particular process. So when you as a teacher are modelling, that is the I do. You will use visuals for the explanations, okay, so that your students can actually use those visuals as a reminder and as a hook. And you will work through examples, actually articulating the processes you go through so the students can actually follow those particular steps and note them down. Now, with the we do, it basically means that you and the students are working through another example, following the principles you've actually modeled. And you would look at faded work examples. And the next slide will actually show what a faded work example looks like. You may co-create. So the students may say to you about what they've actually worked out and then use that to co-create the explanations and steps that they can then use, maybe as in pairs or small groups. And then your students will actually try and go through another example using the principles. So there'll be no tips or guides to see whether they've taken it on board. And then when you provide it and hand it over to them, that's the you do. You give the students time to practice through deliberate aspects by themselves or maybe in pairs. And then the students actually work through this and go through the whole process from memory. So there are, as I say, 8 steps to that. Now, by a faded example, if you look at example 1, you've got the multiplication, you've got the steps to show the working out and the final answer. But as you go from example 1 to example 5, you'll see that different aspects have been removed. So in the end, by the time they get to the 5th example, all they've got is the actual problem to work through. So by faded examples, you actually remove the scaffolding so the students gain more independence. Deliberate practice means that there are specific skills that you want your students to actually work upon. And there are 5 steps to that. Be clear about what that specific skill is and isolate it. Give the students time to develop and assess the skill, and then give an opportunity to have maybe like an assessment or exam to undertake a final performance. But then, most key with number 5, given opportunities to revisit a day later, a week later, a month later, particularly if they're working towards terminal exams where they will need to revisit those particular skills. Your activities, efficient. Now, I'll quote Occam's law here about keeping it simple and straightforward, because if you're like me, sometimes we can pack too many things in to activities, which may confuse students that have additional learning needs. Clarity and simplicity is key for them. So with Occam's law, there's some aspects to consider. What is the least that needs to happen for your students to make progress towards their next learning milestone? What is the least amount of explanation they need before they can actually move on? And this will get you to really hone in and simplify what you say. Some of the most effective lessons, the teacher explanation is brief but specific and clear, that the students know exactly what they're learning and what they need to do to progress. And then the last question is, what is the least amount of deliberate practice my students need in order to keep revisiting the skill that you've actually isolated and you want them to actually address? Now, and another thing with regards to efficient activities, efficient teaching activities, the teacher talk. Now, this is not to say that teachers that talk for more than 10 minutes is an issue. It is not an issue. It is about being very specific in what you say, what you want your students to know, and being incisive in the learning instructions that you give, because this then frees up more time for the students to demonstrate. Because here's a question. If you are talking for more than 10 minutes, generally, what will your students be doing during that time to demonstrate their learning? And if the answer is not much, this basically gives the argument for actually reducing your teacher talk so that students have more time to demonstrate their learning. Make sure when you have specific learning activities that you don't get students to switch from one thing to another. Students with additional learning needs sometimes need more time to actually disengage from one activity and then go into another one. So having longer periods of time to practice is more important. Aid and ensure success by these principles here. A low floor, high ceiling basically means that you've got specific tasks that every student can actually engage with, but they can all progress with it and within different levels. I'm going to give an example of that. And another one is something that all students can actually start with, but they will not finish, because basically the questions get more and more challenging. And it means that there is progress, stimulation for the students to actually work through. They're actually learning through that. Here's an example about this pet shop. So you've got some images that students can actually recognize and hook. And the question is that there are 7 pets to choose from, and you can actually buy 3 on each occasion, but you cannot buy 2 of the same type. So how many different ways can you buy pets? So even if the young students are not able to provide an answer, they can engage and they can actually work with it in small groups or pairs and try and work out different things. Low floor, high ceiling activity that all students engage with. Here's another type. So this is teaching number lines, and there are 2 questions that you pose. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And you'll notice that some of the letters or numbers are in different colors. You've got different increments between the number line. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Now, if we had more time, I'd actually pause and get you to actually share in your chat what you notice and what you wonder, but these are the type of things that you could actually come up with. You can actually notice that the 0 is black, whereas everything else is either in blue or red. You can talk about the dot that is halfway between the number 2 and 3, and so it goes on. A very simple activity that students can all engage with. If you're doing revision, this is something that I've actually done in the past, where literacy, so in science particularly, literacy is really key, and making sure the students understand and use the key words is an issue. So this is reason why this starts off. So we start off with something quite simple, the literacy aspect. Then they go on to the memory activity here about recalling what the students have done in the past. An explanation where they struggle with reading tables. So you've got an explanation looking at a specific skill, and the stretch is an exam question that links to GCSE. And this is something I would actually give to my Key Stage 3 students who are aged 11 to 14. You could have you could have homework or a project linked to a thinker's key. So a particular topic's being covered, but then you're looking at it in different ways. So think about the predictions. What are the disadvantages? There are lots of different ways. Students can engage with it in different activities, whether they have lower prior ability or the most able students. You've got something that can actually accommodate their learning and go as far as they possibly can. Checking understanding, how do we do this in effective ways? And there are, again, some key principles that we can do this. Now, commonly what we do is we ask students in the class individually to respond to a question, but this takes time. You could use traffic lights, or you have maybe students that hold up a red, amber, or green card, depending what the answer is. Now, this is not precise because some students, what they might do is look around and see that, oh, the common answer is green, and hold up their green. So if you want to do this, it would be good to ask quiz students to explain their thinking behind the answer they've actually selected. You can have multi-student questioning. So you pose a question to one particular student, and other students that you invite to engage may be asked to either expand upon the initial idea or contradict it, or to propose a different way. Or you can actually look at diagnostic questioning, specific questions to check whether students have understood key concepts, and if they don't, it allows you to revisit what's been taught in the lesson. Now, magenta principle is something that works for all ability students because you get them to think about texts, things that they usually find quite boring, in different ways. So this is a concept looking about the evolution of the Earth atmosphere. And there are different things that I ask the students to do. So reduce this. So they've been given a piece of text, but their challenge is to reduce it into a maximum of 40 words. Your most able will really find that really, because they have to make a decision. What do I need to leave out? What are the most important things to include, etc. You could ask them to prioritize which are the key pieces of information that's most important. You could ask them to transform those images into just 10 key words or extend it. So there are lots of different ways in which you could actually use text to get your students to demonstrate their learning and engage with it. Now, you can pose questions in various ways. Finding Nemo is something that many of us have actually watched. So the simplest question is, who is Nemo? Now, the issue obviously is if the students actually don't know about the material you're sharing, they cannot engage with the simplest question, and it highlights that knowledge is key. Then you could actually extend and build upon those particular questions as I've actually given there. Now, when it comes to questioning, the research actually shows that we tend to ask a lot of closed, like one-word questions, and we don't give our students enough time. So believe it or not, we need to spend time planning the type of questions we will actually aim to share with our students. The questions should actually allow us to actually check the prior knowledge of the students, engage and challenge their thinking, and actually drill down to particular concepts. And these are some of the ways in which your students can actually engage with it. Now, there aren't necessarily good or bad questions, but there are some questions that would help your students to really challenge their thinking and get them to articulate their answers. And these are a variety that you can actually see on the screen, so many different types. You can use Bloom's taxonomy to help you expand upon the questions that you actually pose. You can even use Costa. Now, Costa basically has summarized Bloom's taxonomy into 3 levels. Level 1, where you can simply find the answers in the text. Level 2, the answers are not quite there, but there are inferences that you pick up, as you can actually see here. And level 3 goes beyond the text. So you can use the Costa levels in different ways, from the knowledge base to the more challenging aspects where you get students to evaluate and extend their thinking. You could get students to think about something. So here is an image, here's a question. What happened 50 years before this, or 5 days before? What could actually happen 5 days after and 50 years after? So the students engaging and sharing their answers as well. Similar type of thing with this particular image. Now, if you need something to actually help you plan the more extensive, more challenging questions, this thinking grid is really key. So you can actually have who can. So, you know, you've got a person and looking at possibilities. The idea is that where you get towards the bottom right-hand side, those questions are more challenging and will require the students to think and actually provide more in-depth responses. Here's an example of that. And here's another way of you can use that in a lesson on a regular basis. And what I also do as well is use the questions, and these are quite closed questions, to help my students review their learning. So at the start of a lesson, the students will know whether or not they're going to be posed a question, and I deliberately give it at the start to give them time in the lesson to find the answers and actually formulate their response. They're given that thinking time before they share their answer with myself and the rest of the class. You can also use graphic organizers to help students think about and structure their learning. And this can aid students of all abilities, but particularly students with additional learning needs. Okay, so you've got ways in which different concepts can actually link together. These could be like historical events, for example, as you've seen here. You could actually look at sequencing different things. So again, you provide the students with information, provide the grid and say, how would you place this in order of importance, or the earliest one going on, etc., etc. And these are ways in which you can actually use it. Venn diagrams, which I love, where you're comparing 2 different concepts, but the challenge here is to get the students to think about what actually is an overlay between, and modeling this is really, really key. Doing this as a whole group activity is very powerful. For additional learning students as well, sometimes what they just basically need are a list of instructions to follow through, particularly if they have poor working memories, or they have attention deficiency disorder where their minds may be elsewhere, but they cannot quite remember the sequence of what they've actually got to do. So providing this little checklist for them about how they would navigate their way through the lessons is really key, and it gives them a sense of achievement as they can actually tick off the various things there. And I've used this quite successfully. It can be given to individual students in a discrete manner that engages them, but ensures that they've got the support and they can follow the lesson as with everyone else. I know that's a very quick whistle-stop tour, but as you evaluate your own teaching practice, there are 2 questions I'd like you to think about. What will you now do differently? More importantly, what will you stop doing? Please share your reflections in the chat section. Thank you very much for your time today, and I hope that you've got some ideas of how you can support effectively the teaching and learning of the students with additional learning needs. Thank you. Okay, so thank you. So what I'm now going to do is to look through some of the questions that have been posed. So I've got a question from here. How can schools make sure students with additional learning needs are aware and prepared for challenges in the real world? That's a very good question. And what I would actually say are whole school projects. So in the UK, we call these, say, like cross-curricular projects or drop-down days, where you're actually looking at whole school projects. And they could actually be linked to, for example, ways in which you get students to develop interview skills, or for them to actually prepare how they actually explain themselves, or like debating skills and things like that. So I think it depends on the needs of the students, but the school can actually, you know, like for example, we have links with our communities where we actually maybe get members of the community in appropriate ways to do, you know, like provide work experience. There are some organizations that will actually come into schools that will actually help the students prepare, for example, for university life or apprenticeship. So I think it's about being clear about the needs of the young people that you have and looking at maybe organizations that can actually help support this. I also suggest external organizations, because sometimes when we say, you know, what they should be doing, they just think, oh, you know, what do we know? But if you've got external organizations, it gives it a different feel and the students are more likely to engage with it. So thank you for that question. Are there any more questions being posed? Okay. All right, so here's another question, and thank you very much for posing this. So how can schools make sure they have the right technology and resources or courses for students with additional learning needs? Very good question, and particularly in a post-pandemic world. Again, it's about being clear. So the individual educational plans of the students will actually should highlight the learning barriers that the students actually experience and the type of teaching strategies, first and foremost, that will be required to help their needs. And it's about doing a bit of research about the type of things. So say, for example, there are many schools who will have students with additional learning needs, but they could actually, as part of maybe say, like webinars or training, they actually highlight how they've developed. So it could be students who find who may be reluctant to write things down but are good at articulating. You could use transcription or transcription software. So for example, Google Docs, if you go within tools, you can actually just do voice records and it actually captures what the students say and provide that within a written context so that you can then put that as evidence towards the students' learning. There are so many different things. You've got dictation pens, which may read if students actually struggle to read. The pens actually just scan through the text and it provides an audio. So there are so many different things out there. But what I would actually say is be clear about what the specific learning need is and actually do some research. Google, there are many educators who use Google, who use Office 365, Microsoft and teams like that. There's lots of software that's available for the students, reaching out to special schools. I mean, there are so many different ways, but within the UK, we have demonstrator schools who actually have schools that good practice of using technology for students in all different contexts, including those with additional learning needs. And they advise teachers about the different types of ways in which they use the software and what they can then do within their school context. So thank you for that second question. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for actually having me today and enjoy the rest of day 2's events. Thank you then. Bye-bye.
Such an enlightening session. We all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being with us today.